has been a remarkable renewal of interest in the early medieval period over the last 20 years, but with that has come controversy over sources, the way we think about the past, and even the words that we use. Today, I'm joined by Marc Morris to give us an overview of the whole period, dipping into its most fascinating stories as we talk about his new book, The Anglo-Saxons. I will probably be using the phrase the Dark Ages. That apparently has fallen out of favour. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Marc, welcome to Future Imperfect. Thank you for being here. Can I do what I always ask guests to do? Can you introduce yourself? And then we're going to talk all about your latest book and Anglo-Saxons in particular.
Yes, hello. Well, thank you for having me on. My name's Marc Morris. I am a self-employed medieval historian. I've been doing this now for about 25 years. I've written a number of books on medieval topics in that time, mostly relating to Britain and mostly relating to England after the Norman Conquest. But for the latest book, as you've already said, I went back to the very beginnings of England, to the period between, say, 400 and 1066, and the topic of the Anglo-Saxons.
So this used to be called the Dark Ages, I believe. That's not a particularly liked term now because of the sort of pejoratives around it and all the issues like that. Would you describe it as the early Middle Ages, or do you still quite like the Dark Ages as a term, or is it completely incorrect?
You're right. Dark Ages has fallen out of fashion because it used to be used to apply to all of Europe after the fall of Rome. And since the 1970s, historians have been saying, well, it wasn't that dark. There was still lots of literacy. There was still lots of economic growth, economic development. And also, as you say, in England, the term Dark Ages was applied to everything after Rome right up to 1066. So 6 or more centuries of development were sort of categorized as being dark and sort of backward. I think it very much depends how dark you think it was as to what part of Europe you're in once Rome goes into decline in the 5th century. And I think if someone said to me they were talking about England in the 5th and 6th centuries, and they said, well, the Dark Ages, I think that's a reasonably good descriptive because it's a time without coinage, it's a time when the economy goes into free fall, it's a time without education, it's a time without very basic technologies. You know, things like roads and bridges fall into disrepair and disuse. So it certainly doesn't apply to all of Europe, and it certainly doesn't apply to the whole period, the Anglo-Saxon period. But for the first couple of centuries, they were pretty grim.
So the Romans more or less all went, and they took a ton of infrastructure with them, and it was fairly sudden, I think. But was it reflected in the population? Did the populations wake up one morning and suddenly find all their judges and police and administrators had wandered back to the shore and gone on boats? Was it as simple as that, or is it quite a complex picture?
No, I mean, obviously, by the way you pose the question, it is slightly more complicated than that. I think when people talk about the Romans going, it's not that everybody who is of Roman descent or Roman citizenship decides to leave. What it is that the Roman Empire, the state, decides that Britannia is no longer worth the candle. It's not worth the effort. So plenty of people stay. Soldiers are withdrawn in their tens of thousands, which means you have no police force. So basically, the people who are living in Roman Britain, this includes Roman citizens, are told by people at the centre of the web in Rome or Ravenna, you're on your own. We're not sending you any more troops. We're not sending you any more coin. And so England becomes kind of self-governing, is left to its own devices. And they struggle along, it seems, for a generation or so. But the problem is that without all the networks that have been built up over the centuries when Britain was part of the Roman Empire, they ultimately end up fending for themselves. And it's those systems that have been there and taken for granted so long start to fail. So that's why you say it's not that the infrastructure was withdrawn as such. It's just that there's nobody there to maintain it. If you think about the very basic things that a state provides for today, like security, like defense, like coinage, like a judiciary, if all those things start to fail and it becomes a failed state, then it becomes much more primitive and you get the rise of people fending for themselves literally and defending themselves, so warlordism. So that's what you're looking at when Rome withdraws at the start of the 5th century.
then do people start traveling, and I suppose your horizons would shrink if that happened. You become, as you said, warlords. You become sort of localized because there isn't any particular good reason to look outside. You've got to look inwards for your infrastructure and your maintenance. Did any institutions actually survive, and what sort of things actually stopped happening in general?
Well, this is always the thing that people tend to focus on in interviews, and it's the period I know least about because it's the worst documented, and I'm not an archaeologist, so I have to sort of take this on trust from archaeologists. As far as I can determine, very little survives. I mean, when you think about Roman Britain or Roman institutions, you're thinking about not just roads and cities, but things like temples and gods that are no longer worshipped. When you think about the end of the Anglo-Saxon period, and you've got a situation where you've got shires and sheriffs and bishops and boroughs and kings and thanes. And, they are still words that are familiar because they have a continuous existence into the post-medieval period. But none of the Roman stuff survives, except as kind of crumbling ruins that the Anglo-Saxons kind of were in awe of, but didn't really understand their origins, other than they've been built by some previous and now vanished civilization. But to return to something you said at the start of the question, yes, you're right. I think society becomes much, much more localized and its concerns become, and they had been pan-European. And all of a sudden, you're in a situation where if you just think of something as simple as, I want to buy your chicken, if you've got no coins, then you've got no way of storing value. So any trade you have to make has to be face to face. You can't sort of say, I'll give you these 10 coins for it. So you have to say, I'll give you my trousers if you give me your chicken. And it has to be there and then. So everything becomes all of a sudden a much smaller world. The communities are much smaller. I mean, there are no longer people living in towns and cities. So there's no community, probably more than 200 or 300 people at most. So yeah, all of a sudden the horizons are much, much closer.
I mean, it sounds like a historical post-apocalyptic situation. I mean, it isn't Mad Max, but it's sort of the equivalent of. I mean, let's move on a little bit in time to sort of after the first 200-300 years. What's that? 6 or 7 generations? What starts to happen and what starts to develop?
Well, once you've got the institutions that have been Roman have completely failed, and you've also, one of the things that we haven't mentioned at all is the Anglo-Saxons. So you have in this period, at the same time that Rome withdraws, people who had been around the fringes of Britannia, so Picts to the north, Scots-Irish to the west, and Saxons, Germanic peoples, Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, etc., to the east. They all start piling in because whereas the people who've been living in Britain and have been sort of mosaic layers or painters or playwrights or slaves or vintners or whatever, people who'd had very sort of narrowly defined economic positions, as they find that their life has become a misery, the people around the periphery start to see a land of opportunity, a land where if you are skilled with a sword, good at building your own infrastructure, whether it's your own wooden hall or house or ships, you can go across from what is now North Germany or southern Scandinavia and live like a king or live like a petty king. You can carve out your own tiny piece of paradise, setting yourself up as a warlord if you've got the followers with the strong right arms in order to do that. I mean, one of the things that I often have to remind people about the late Roman state is that civilians aren't allowed to bear arms. The state had a monopoly of security and violence. Once that's withdrawn, the society that's left cannot learn those skills of war or relearn them overnight. But the people who've been sort of nibbling at the edges of Roman Britannia while it was still in existence, all of a sudden they are able to arrive and they sort of hold the big stick. So they are able to sort of, as I say, create petty fiefdoms for themselves. And that's what you see happening in the 5th and 6th centuries. What you get, to move the story on a bit, what happens towards the end of the 6th century is that some of those powerful people start to really lord it over the others. And you seem to have a period of very intense competition where certain individuals, we can see from the way they're buried, they're not just buried as they have been in the past with a sword and a shield or some jewelry, but they are buried with mountains of jewelry. They are buried in specially constructed burial chambers. They are, in one famous instance in the early 7th century, the Sutton Hoo ship burial, buried amidships in a ship that has been drawn ashore. And so what we see there around the turn of the 6th and 7th centuries, around the year 600, is the beginnings of kingdoms, the beginnings of people who are styling themselves as king from that point. And from that point, you can see Not exactly a return to stability, because there's an intensive knockout competition between these kingdoms, but you can see certain elements that will lead to stability further down the line first occurring.
Is the feudal system entirely Norman, or does a kind of feudal system start? Because if you've got sort of high kings, as it were, and then petty kings, you've got a scale of leadership as well, and allegiance of one sort or another to a bigger organization. Does the feudal system map to this at all, or was that an entirely new thing kind of brought over by the Normans?
It's a very good question, because one of the things that is always taught to children, especially in the UK, is the feudal system does arrive with the Normans. And they say you picture it as a pyramid or a triangle with the king at the top. And, my sons came home from school and told me about the Normans introducing the feudal system. And whenever I'm sort of being mischievous and I get to talk in schools, I'll say, well, describe the Norman feudal pyramid. And the kids do that. King at the top, the barons beneath the king, the knights beneath the barons, the peasants beneath the knights. And I'll say, well, who was in charge before the conquest? Oh, it was Edward the Confessor. And what was he? He was a king. And who was below him? Oh, well, that was the earls, like Harold Godwinson, Earl Elfgar. So you basically say it's exactly the same before the conquest. Now, you have a hierarchy of lordship. So I would say probably in order to have like something that can be described as feudalism, which is basically a word historians don't like to use very much anymore, probably you're looking at the 9th, 10th centuries, when you get a much more intense concentration on land and the control of land, and land being parcelled out both to sort of lords beneath a superior lord and peasants forced into a much harsher form of serfdom. So whereas in this early period, what you've got is kings saying, I am your king, and people being obliged to give food renders that they deliver at some central spot, it becomes a lot more intensive in the 9th and 10th centuries, depending on which part of England you're in. So you can certainly see feudalism prior to the Norman conquest, centuries prior to the Norman conquest. You probably wouldn't deem it that in the 7th century. But you're right. I mean, there's a fundamental thing is as soon as you get superior lords, kings, bishops, abbots, then you are going to get people further down the chain who'd previously thought of themselves as free, forced into some form of dependency.
One of the things with my study of history is the absolutes that I was taught at school and need to be simplified, I suppose, for people like that. But the more you look into it, the more blurred you find these boundaries and the more unclear sometimes. Do you find when you study, the more you study something, like studying for this book, you study it more and more and it almost becomes unclear the more you know? Or is that just me?
It does to some extent. I think that can persist for weeks leading into months. But there comes a point where you kind of wake up one morning and go, I think I've got my head around this, and it's actually very simple, And you start to sort of see that there's a reason people break history into periods. And there are certain points like the Norman conquest of 1066, which is a very good end point and start point for a new chapter. And there are lots of bona fide reasons why the Norman conquest is a watershed moment. But I think feudalism isn't one of those. One of the things that you're sort of always trying to do as a historian is to try and transcend the sort of models or the paradigms that are handed down to you from a previous generation and just look at the evidence afresh. Mm-hmm. And often you realize you're at that stage because you think, I don't get this. I just don't get why they think this model applies when you look at the evidence. Sometimes it's really, really obvious. And sometimes you end up thinking, everything I'm reading here, I don't agree with, because the answer seems very, very simple. So it can kind of cut both ways.
One of the things that I think attract people about the Anglo-Saxons in particular, the treasures and the hoards and the crafts, the creation of things. And obviously hoards, people metal detecting and finding things. You mentioned Sutton Hoo, finding gold and garnet, swords and helmets. It kind of captures the imagination. But is there more that the existence of hoards can tell us about the society that they were created in? Because I think it's fascinating. It's about treasure, apart from anything else. But what does it mean in a broader context?
Well, one of the best things I read on hoards was by a historian who taught me 25 years ago. It was my doctoral supervisor, John Madicott. And he described hoards as those reliable barometers of instability. In other words, if times are good, you can keep all your gold and silver and bling in your hall or your church. But if there are bands of armed men roaming the country, happy to take them off you at the drop of a hat, then you panic and bury them in the ground. And you can see that really interestingly kind of hordes across the centuries. So not just the medieval centuries, but on into the early modern period. You can see certain periods where the incidence of hordes just spikes. And the biggest spike by a very long chalk, not a period I know anything about, but the biggest spike is the English Civil War, or the civil wars in Britain in the 17th century.
Right. How interesting. I've never heard of hordes associated with that period in history. Right.
But you do.
Yeah.
You know, you get people burying things in the ground. I mean, there's a famous instance in the late 17th century when Samuel Pepys, I mentioned this at the start of the Anglo-Saxons book, he panics because he hears the Dutch are coming up the Medway and he thinks they're going to take London. And he sort of goes around burying stuff. He sends a note to his wife in Cambridgeshire to bury some of their gold treasure and stuff, or gold coins, and subsequently has great difficulty in finding them again. But that's exactly what you get. You get it in the Norman Conquest, you get a spike in hoarding, you get a spike during the Viking invasions, and you get a very large spike at the end of Roman Britain. I start the Anglo-Saxons book with the discovery of the Hoxton hoard in Suffolk in 1992, I think it was. And it was the biggest hoard of Roman coins ever discovered. So yeah, that's my basic take on hordes is, yes, they are fascinating. And what they tell us above all else is that things were going really badly at that point. Also, that people hoped that things were going to go back to the way they were. I think people putting those things into the ground in late Roman Britain, they weren't putting them in the ground and thinking, well, that's that. They were thinking, in 10 years' time, I'll come back and I'll remember this tree and this mark I've put on this rock, and I'll be able to, go back to the way things were. So they speak of kind of hope for the future.
Yeah, that's interesting. Are they distributed geographically at all?
I think I've muddied this because we're talking about two separate things. I've started talking about the post-Roman hordes, and you were talking about sort of hoarding in later centuries.
Right, yeah, sorry.
I mean, I think the distinction to be made is in the Anglo-Saxon period is people are buried with their treasure, which is not a form of hoarding. That's a form of like, these are the things you're going to carry with you to the afterlife. And these are ostentatious ways of burying you because you're a king. Because kings are anxious to advertise their power and their glory after their departure from this realm. And so that, they become sort of monumentalized and almost kind of a sort of semi-spiritual form of projecting power. But yeah, I mean, you're right. These kind of things, again, we're still kind of in the early period because this thing is emphatically not encouraged once you've converted to Christianity, which we haven't even got onto yet. Once the Anglo-Saxons have converted from the turn of the 6th and 7th centuries, then the churchmen are saying, no, don't bury all your stuff in a pagan mound. Found a church, found a monastery, and then endow that with riches, and then we will kind of continue to pray for you for the rest of forever.
Yes, it's a form of insurance in the afterlife. So back when you were buried with your riches, that serves presumably for your descendants to prove how wealthy and powerful the family is, because you can afford to bury this stuff with the Lord that's just passed away, and is sort of cementing your seniority. And then the church comes along and says, can we have that instead?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's just a different way of doing things. If you endow us, then we will pray for your soul for the rest of forever. And that's what you want. So the thing about the Anglo-Saxons is, I think in the popular imagination, they are much more like Sutton Hoo, the Sutton Hoo helmet. The imagery in your head is more Tolkien-esque. It's like Beowulf. It's to do with kind of epic poetry. It's to do with the Anglo-Saxons at their pagan height, which is, of course, the first couple of centuries. By the time you get to the end of the 7th century, all the rulers, if not all the people that they rule over, have converted to Christianity. And then the next 4 centuries, they are doing things differently.
So was it a type of Christianity we would recognize today, or was it a sort of its own flavor? I mean, this was a fairly isolated island in many ways. Did it have its own take on Christianity in the same way other places might?
Well, I think the most interesting period for me in that conversion period is the fact that you've got Christianity, or rather the evangelization of what becomes England, comes from 2 directions. The first people to arrive are the missionaries led by St. Augustine, who come from Rome. And that's, kind of Christianity that we are more familiar with. But you've also got a missionary effort that comes ultimately from Ireland, and Celtic Christianity, if you like, coming from Ireland via the west coast of Scotland, and then converting the kings of Northumbria, who set them up on an island off the coast of Northumbria, which is Lindisfarne. So this is St. Aidan, again, the sort of start of the 7th century. And the Roman mission, which seems to kind of go good guns for the first 2 or 3 decades, almost peters out by the middle of the 7th century. And the Northumbrian missionaries, the ones that ultimately come from Ireland, are going, making good headway. So they are converting kings further south in East Anglia and in Mercia. And this leads to a big showdown in the 660s between the Roman Church and the Celtic Church. And that's where you see the distinctions between the way Christianity had developed in Ireland in relative isolation. I mean, these things seem petty to us now, but the kind of differences in the way they dressed, differences in the way they behaved, the difference in the way that monks had their tonsures. The crucial difference is that they celebrate Easter on different days, or rather they calculate Easter in different ways. And in a secularized age, that sounds very pettifogging. Like, so you have Easter on one day and we have Easter on another day. What's the difference? But it's the holiest day of the year. This is the day on which, your savior is crucified. So if you cannot agree on that,
Yeah, it's fundamental, isn't it?
You're going to castigate the other people as heretical.
Was it effectively church wars in many ways, or did it come to blows as such, or was it more, would ordinary people have noticed this? Would there be different factions in the way that there are sometimes in some parts of the world today?
No, it doesn't lead to a kind of a split in which people pick up swords. But it does lead to a very vicious war of words, and it's finally resolved at a synod in Whitby, in what is now Yorkshire, in 664. And to skip to the end, the Roman Church wins out. So going forward, there is not a great deal of room for Celtic Christianity. So from that point on, although there are periods when it's interrupted, the fact that England is now, or what eventually becomes England, this galaxy of competing kingdoms, the fact that they are Christianized does mean that they are now once again part of the European mainstream. So that now they've got people coming and going to and from Europe. One of the main things that Christianity reintroduces is literacy, because the Anglo-Saxons have been illiterate. They might have etched the names of their swords on their swords with runes, but they didn't routinely write things down. Whereas once you've got Christianity coming back into southern Britain and ultimately northern Britain, then you've got the power of the book once again. And this is really important in the way that government develops, and not just the church, but the way government develops. Once you've got literacy, you can have not only law codes written down, but you can have land deeds, charters. So you're able to say, not just, this is my land, I've always held this land, my grandfather fought for this land, and people say, well, what's your proof, If you've got a piece of parchment from the king that says the king gave this land to my grandfather, then the society is trusting of documents again and documentary proof. So this is all very important in terms of the sort of reintroduction of stability in law.
So did the church unify in the sort of Roman Christianity? That predates the sort of creation of England. So do you think it was a precursor to these petty kingdoms or the smaller kingdoms? It's sort of a reason why they might join together into a structure like England much later. I mean, what time difference are we talking here from this sort of church thing happening and then beginnings of what we might recognise as modern England?
Oh, I'd say a good 3.5 centuries. What the introduction of Christianity gives you is, one, it's kind of the introduction of literacy, and two, it's a new form of worship. And I think the thing is that Christianity is very seductive, and it's associated with Rome. And even when Rome is at its lowest ebb, Rome is associated with kind of ancient authority and power. So if you are, say, the King of Kent or the King of Mercia or the King of Northumbria, and you're communicating with the Pope in Rome, and the Pope is able to send you not just men who are dressed in this very exotic way in purple robes with kind of finely wrought kind of treasures, but they're sending them things, they're sending them indications or tokens of power. So when you get letters written by Gregory the Great to Ethelbert, King of Kent, it's like, here is a gold cape for you, and here is a mirror for your queen. They're sending them these to say, we are a powerful, rich, civilized religion. You could join this club. Not only will you enjoy being part of this kind of, broader, more powerful kind of zone, but also you'll live forever. You'll live forever in the afterlife. So it's a very seductive proposition, Christianity, to these pagan kings. And I think you can see why they were fairly quick, after a century and a half or so, to ditch their old gods in favour of the new.
And there's a lot of propaganda in the presentation of power as well here, isn't there? The idea of sending gifts and capturing people's attention. Because you talked about the Roman ruins being something other for the Anglo-Saxons. It's something that came from the past, this idea of giants in the past building these amazing buildings. That must have had some resonance even later on, when suddenly the place that calls itself Rome is talking to you. These are the descendants of the giants, perhaps. Is that something that's noticeable?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, for example, that the first missionaries do when they are looking to found monasteries or bishoprics is they go for old Roman centres. Even though those old Roman centres are no longer centres of habitation in any sense. So you've had nearly 2 centuries or a century and a half of places like London or York or Winchester or any Roman town or city you care to mention being abandoned and left to sort of turn into ghost towns. When the missionaries turn up, they're founding a bishopric in London at the very early 7th century. No one else is living there, but this is a place still that has this kind of memory of Roman power having once been there. It's also, if you're building new churches, it's a very handy place to find pre-cut stone. It's rather than building on a greenfield site, you recycle the stone. You see that all over Anglo-Saxon England. The earliest Anglo-Saxon churches from the 7th century, both in Northumbria and elsewhere, are used with recycled Roman materials. It's not just a way of saving labour. It's a way of buying into that Roman power. So although they won't become commercial centres for many centuries after the 7th century, this is the reason you have bishops in Winchester, bishops in Dorchester, bishops in London, an archbishop in Canterbury, because Canterbury had been a great Roman city.
So it's almost a form of stolen valour, in a way, to use a modern term.
Yeah.
They're kind of claiming the bragging rights of being associated with this folk memory almost of the Romans back then, pre-medieval.
But I think it's what people do throughout the whole Anglo-Saxon period. So even when you've got kings who are genuinely very, very powerful, skipping forward many centuries now to sort of the 10th century, and a king like Athelstan, who has good claim to be the ruler of the first king of England, in that he rules not just Wessex, not just Mercia and East Anglia, but also annexes Northumbria. So he's ruling something close in geographical terms to modern England. Whenever they decide to hold very, very big king's councils or assemblies, royal assemblies, and they're assembling people from all over Britain, encouraging them with a capital E to kind of come and pay court, the places they choose to do these things are the most ancient places they can find. So they will either be in something that dates back to the Roman period or even earlier. In the case of Athelstan, he holds a famous assembly at Cirencester. And, you cannot prove he did that because Cirencester has a huge Roman amphitheatre outside it to this day. You can still go and see the site of it and the mounds there. But even in the fragment of a charter we have from Athelstan, he talks about Cirencester, the famous city of the Romans.
Right.
And, his descendant Edgar is crowned in Bath, which, again, still has surviving Roman stonework, but in the 10th century had a lot more surviving Roman stonework. So you're looking at the landscape and seeing, being aware of the fact that these are places of power going back literally to time immemorial, time out of mind. And so naturally, they're the places that resonate with power, and you want to harness that for your own political purposes.
I think that's fascinating. They're sort of using that to cement their power. They're saying, look, we're associated with this great past. I've got 2 other topics that I want to talk about. One is, how do the Vikings fit in your narrative here? And something that you may poo-poo, but the legend of King Arthur and the complexity of that, that sort of sits in this time period, doesn't it? The sort of post-Roman, early Anglo-Saxon.
Well, let's do Arthur quickly, because Arthur is easy to dismiss. But yes, the legends of Arthur, they don't grow up until the 12th century. We have fleeting references to Arthur in earlier sources, some of which the dating is debatable. But the earliest ones you can be certain of are 9th century references. And then you get the fully fledged Arthur legend, the stories of King Arthur, developed in the 1130s by a writer called Geoffrey of Monmouth, who, as far as anyone has been able to determine, is just completely making it up as he goes along.
Right,
but it's such a persuasive legend and story that it becomes the best-selling book effectively in Europe. In terms of the medieval manuscripts that survive, or manuscripts that survive from the Middle Ages, the most popular is the Bible, and the second, by not much less of a margin, is Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. So it's an absolute wildfire bestseller. Right. So that's where the notion of King Arthur comes from. Whether there's any truth in those legends has been debated for centuries.
Yes.
That will continue to be the case.
Yes.
But you're right. Those legends, they are posited in a post-Roman Britain in which the Saxons are invading, the Angles and the Saxons are invading, and Arthur is the hero of the British resistance. He's the person who keeps the Saxons at bay. The other part of the question, the Vikings turn up at the very end of the 8th century. And they are, I've never used this formulation before, so I don't know why I try it now, but they are kind of like the Anglo-Saxons Mark II.
Right.
Because they are hailing from much the same area. They're coming slightly further north, maybe. They're coming from Scandinavia, but they are a second wave of pagan invasions of Britain and Ireland. And I think that's one of the reasons that the Anglo-Saxons sort of fear them, because they are kind of like the Anglo-Saxons as they had been 3 or 4 centuries earlier. They are a sort of pagan people. The fact that they aren't Christian makes them all the more frightening, because the Anglo-Saxons in the meantime have kind of learnt to embrace Christianity and learnt that there are certain things which are sacrosanct, i.e. you don't go round attacking other people's monasteries and churches because, you'll burn in hell for eternity. The Vikings don't buy into any of that. They just look at these monasteries that have grown up for 2 or 3 centuries, stuffed with gold and silver, beyond the dreams of avarice. They literally turn up on these islands and say, so it's just the 15 of you, is it, with no swords? So they go in the first case for the very easy pickings. And by the time you get to the sort of 3rd quarter of the 9th century, the Vikings are coming in huge numbers, having been opportunists in the first instance. They are turning up in, 50, 60, 70 ships. So there's thousands of armed men on a scale which means they are able to tackle and defeat the armies that can be raised by Anglo-Saxon kings. So what you see by the 860s, 870s is the now long-established kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Wessex as well, they start to fall. And it's only Wessex that survives that invasion. So the Vikings really are a very, very important upsetting of the apple cart. And, England, or the various component kingdoms that become England, have been developing and to some extent stabilizing and becoming richer and more prosperous for several centuries. And then the Vikings kind of threaten all of that. And it really is an existential threat, which, as I say, only one of them, only Wessex, survives.
I find it fascinating. I'd never thought about the mirror, because you've got the Anglo-Saxons coming in armed with a sort of soft underbelly of the post-Roman situation where population has been protected by others. You've got the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons and arguably moving away from the pagan side of things and possibly, arguably, growing less warlike. You have more of a structure and a hierarchy, and you have less need to fight in society. And then suddenly there's this new wave of, hang on, that was us a few hundred years ago. This isn't fair. Is that fair to say? I mean, I've never thought of the Vikings as a sort of second wave of settlers in that way.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that they were less warlike. I mean, because ultimately the kings of Wessex do defeat the Vikings. I think, to simplify it, perhaps to oversimplify it, it's much easier to destroy things than it is to build things. It's much easier to be the disruptors. You just turn up on your longships, attack the sort of emerging trading emporia like London, like Winchester, which are just full of merchants. So it's not exactly that they've been caught napping. It's just that they've taken this world for granted, where you can have prosperous market towns, or you can have incredibly richly endowed monasteries, and no one's going to touch them, because in the wars that they fight among themselves, these places are either sacrosanct, or you'd be sort of, hurting yourselves if you attack markets or you attack your own people. When you get people coming in, like the Vikings, and they just see all this kind of opportunity and they're not restrained by a belief system that they don't share, all of a sudden it's like, well, these guys don't play by the rules. We'd established this way of doing warfare and politics, and these guys aren't playing ball. So it does force them to sort of rethink the way they fight. I mean, the other thing, this is an incredibly off the hoof, unthought out answer, but it's much easier to do war when it's attacking, aggressive warfare, and it's effectively making the running. It's much harder to get people to fight when they're on the defensive, because it's kind of what's in it for me. When you're sort of talking about the expansion of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, it's aristocratic led, and you say, follow me, we're going to go and attack Northumbria, and if we win, which we almost certainly will, we will come back rich. We'll just get all the booty and all the slaves we can, whatever, When you're saying you must follow me because we have to defend Winchester, otherwise its merchants are going to get slaughtered again, well, what's the incentive for you there?
Exactly.
And so it's very hard to motivate people in terms of self-defense. And that's true across all of Europe. It's not just, this is why the Vikings make such hay, even against, the Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne or Charlemagne's successors. It's much harder to get people to fight to defend something than it is to kind of get them to fight to enrich themselves.
Yeah, because I suppose ultimately, if you Vikings are coming, you just move out of their way and let somebody else deal with it. You can escape, well, you think you can escape by backing off. You don't really need to confront them, especially if they're raiding. They raid, they go away again. Oh dear. It's awful.
Yeah.
But from a human psychology point of view, if you get out of there, you're not in trouble anymore.
Or you just have to stand sentry the whole time, and that's really, really expensive if you're dealing with raiders. It's significant that once the Vikings start to settle in any numbers, which they do from the 870s onwards, then within a generation or two, they are defeated and conquered by the kings of Wessex. Because, to go back to my original point, it's much easier to smash things up and disrupt things than it is to settle down and govern things.
Mm.
So as soon as the Vikings settle and start to try and govern East Anglia and Northumbria by themselves, then they just become the new neighbours, and they're far less well organised than the kings of Wessex, who've been on a war footing for a couple of generations.
And so the tables are turned and it becomes the other way round. You can go and raid them and take what they've built up over the last few generations.
We'll have all that shiny stuff back, please.
What about, we talked about literacy coming in the later period. Were the Vikings literate in the same way? What did they think of this religious writing? Obviously, they didn't share the belief. So what did they think of all these illuminated manuscripts or equivalent?
I think in the first instance, they just view them as part of the booty. I mean, you do find interesting instances where they're clearly aware of their value, not just because they are, encrusted with gold covers or, richly illuminated, but because they're aware of their spiritual value to the Anglo-Saxons. You find certain manuscripts that survive to this day that have inscriptions that say, this manuscript was ransomed from the heathen men, and this is what we paid for it, and so we got it back. So just as they are seizing powerful men, bishops, archbishops in some instances, and saying, how much do you want for this guy? Undamaged. Yeah. So too, they're doing it with some of the treasures. So they are like their Anglo-Saxon predecessors 2 or 3 centuries earlier. They are illiterate in the first instance. And, it's an ongoing debate of more than 50 years about just how destructive the Vikings were. I personally think they were very destructive. And I think you can see that in the fact that organised Christianity in the north and east of England just disappears in the space of a generation. So it's like, well, where's the Bishop of Lincoln gone? He doesn't exist anymore. Where's the Bishop of Norwich? Or where are the bishops in East Anglia at Elmham and Bromholm? They're just gone. There are no abbeys, there are no monasteries, there are no bishops, etc. Individual Vikings might, within a generation or so, convert to Christianity and found churches and start worshipping the gods of the people that their fathers or grandfathers had killed. But nevertheless, the institutional damage is done, and it takes Eastern England and Northern England quite a long time to recover from that.
They may well have been illiterate, but they were quite savvy business people in that they knew these things had value. They weren't just taking the manuscripts and thinking, well, we could just light fires with them. I'm sure that did happen a bit.
Oh, no.
They were catching on. They were going, money. We can sell this back to them, basically.
Well, it's all about money. I mean, the Vikings don't start to settle for about 75 years after the initial raids start. So from the very first, it's all about easy pickings and riches.
And that's about 3 generations worth, isn't it, roughly?
Yeah, which suggests that, although you get sort of much, much later writers of sagas saying, there was a terrible desire for land among these people, and that, there's no evidence of Vikings settling down and seizing land, at least in England, until you get to the 870s, 80 years or so after they start raiding. So when you say savvy businessmen, yeah, they are predators. And people often say, well, one of the questions that used to be set at university was, were the Vikings more raiders than traders or traders than raiders? And it's like, do you know what? You can be both.
Yeah.
You can go and raid something from one community, and then you can take it across the channel and sell it to your Viking friends in Normandy. So, it's, corporate raiders.
It's hardcore business.
Yeah.
Armed business. Well, look, that's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for taking the time to talk. Was there anything else you wanted to end on?
Oh, we left out so much.
I know, that's the trouble with talking about history.
The risk of sounding incredibly venal, it's all in the book. I mean, we've dipped in and ranged across 6 centuries. I suppose a concluding thought, which is the thought I begin the book with, just to emphasize, is that I think one of the things that this shows is people tend to lump it all together and say, well, the Anglo-Saxons, it's a dark age. And it's as ridiculous as lumping together the centuries between, say, the 14th century and the 18th century.
Right.
If you think of those centuries, there's vast economic and social development, literary development, economic development across those centuries. So too, and perhaps even greater, is the extent of development between the fall of Rome in Britain and the Norman conquest. If you take a figure someone's familiar with, like Harold Godwinson, the King of England before the conquest, and imagine the world he lived in, with towns and cities that in some cases had populations running into, if not 5 figures, then nearly 5 figures. So very large by medieval standards, towns and cities. And it's a world of shires and sheriffs and bishops and boroughs, and a lot of things that we would be familiar with today. It's a unified kingdom with one king, 2 archbishops, a taxation system, one coinage that runs throughout the whole realm, a network of roads and bridges. It would seem to us recognizably a sort of a prototype England. If you compare that to the way the Anglo-Saxons were, running around or walking around the ruins of Roman civilization in the 5th century, there's this vast gulf. So that's one of the things I try to do in the book, is to try and tease out the way that England developed from these unpromising beginnings. And you can see there's a vast amount of development in that more than half a millennium.
It's one of the problems with talking about history is the more you find out about one area, the more you realize geographically and in time and in all senses, it's quite complex. But what's the name of your book, and is it available in the usual places one would buy books?
Yes, the book is called The Anglo-Saxons. It's subtitled History of the Beginnings of England. And yes, it's available wherever you get your books.
Fantastic. And if people are interested in finding more out about your work and what you do, are there any sort of websites or social media handles you want to share?
I wish I had a good website. It's now sadly defunct. But you can find me by Googling me or going on Amazon or wherever. I do tweet. That's about the only thing I do with social media. I'm at Longshanks1307, which is a callback to my first book, which was a biography of Edward I.
Wonderful. Marc, thank you so much for chatting. I look forward to speaking to you another time.
When another book's finished, yes.
Okay.
It's been a pleasure, Jason. Thank you.